Widowed nurse saves cruel ex-husband's life, but when he tries to ruin her again, she unleashes a secret plan that shocks the entire town and leaves him desperate for control. Linda stood at the edge of her small, tidy kitchen, gazing out the window at the sun-dappled garden. The morning light filtered through the leaves, casting soft patterns on the floor. The house, modest yet cozy, had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could breathe freely without the weight of fear pressing down on her. The town had always been her anchor, a haven of familiarity where everyone knew everyone else's business, but in a comforting way. The townsfolk respected Linda, not just for her skill as a nurse, but for her resilience. They had watched her bloom again after Mark's death, their gentle words and quiet support helping her heal in ways that she hadn't thought possible. Every morning, Linda followed the same routine, a ritual that brought her comfort. She would prepare a pot of coffee, savoring the rich aroma that filled the kitchen, then step outside to tend to her garden. The garden had been Mark's idea, a place to grow their own vegetables and herbs, a symbol of life and growth. After his passing, Linda found solace in the act of nurturing the plants, feeling connected to him with each new sprout that pushed through the soil. This connection to Mark, though bittersweet, was one of the few things that kept her grounded. But as she knelt by the tomato plants, her thoughts inevitably drifted back to the years before Mark, to a time she had tried hard to forget. Tom had been her first love, a man whose smile could light up a room, but whose temper could destroy it just as quickly. The early days of their marriage were filled with passion and promises, but it wasn't long before his true nature began to show. The insults, the isolation, the threats, all came gradually, until Linda found herself trapped in a life she no longer recognized. Escaping Tom had been like waking from a nightmare, and meeting Mark afterward had felt like a second chance at happiness. Linda shook her head, trying to dispel the dark memories that threatened to intrude on her morning peace. She had worked too hard to reclaim her life to let thoughts of Tom spoil it now. After all, he was long gone, a chapter in her life that was firmly closed. With a deep breath, she stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands, allowing herself a small smile as she admired her handiwork in the garden. The day stretched ahead of her, filled with the familiar tasks of work at the hospital, where she could lose herself in the care of others, leaving no room for her own worries. The hospital was where Linda felt most like herself, where she could channel her compassion and skills into something meaningful. She had always been drawn to nursing, the idea of helping others through their darkest times resonating deeply with her. The patients she cared for were not just cases. They were people with stories, fears, and hopes, and Linda treated each one as if they were the most important person in the world. Her colleagues admired her for this, often turning to her for advice or just a comforting word when the days grew long and the cases difficult. As Linda drove to the hospital, the radio played softly in the background, a soundtrack to the blur of fields and trees that lined the road. Her thoughts wandered back to Mark, as they often did during these quiet moments. She missed him fiercely, the way his laughter would fill a room, the steady strength of his presence. But even in her grief, Linda found reasons to be grateful. Grateful for the love they had shared, for the memories that would never fade, and for the way he had helped her see her own worth after Tom had shattered her confidence. Arriving at the hospital, Linda parked her car and took a moment to gather herself. She had grown accustomed to the rhythm of her workdays, the ebb and flow of activity that kept her mind occupied. But today, there was an uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach, a sense that something was just slightly off. She brushed it aside, chalking it up to lingering memories from earlier that morning. As she walked through the doors, she was greeted by the familiar sounds and sights of the hospital. The murmur of voices, the soft beeping of monitors, the rush of nurses moving from one task to another. Linda slipped into her routine with practiced ease, checking on her patients, offering smiles and reassuring words as she moved from room to room. The day passed in a blur of activity, the hours marked by the steady hum of work. It was in these moments, surrounded by the bustle of the hospital, that she felt most in control, her past unable to touch her here. And yet, as the day wore on, that nagging feeling of unease persisted, a subtle but persistent weight that she couldn't quite shake. By the time her shift ended, Linda was ready to head home, eager to leave the strange unease behind and return to the quiet comfort of her house. But as she made her way to the exit, she was stopped by a familiar voice, one that sent a chill down her spine. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him. Tom, standing there in the hospital corridor, looking more haggard and worn than she remembered, but unmistakably the same man who had once made her life a living hell. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the walls of the hospital closing in around her, as memories she had long buried came rushing back. The hospital was quieter than usual when the call came in, an emergency case, a man critically injured in a late-night car accident. Linda, already weary from a long shift, felt a familiar surge of adrenaline as she prepared herself for what was to come. The ER was her battlefield, where she fought to keep her emotions at bay and focus solely on the task at hand. But as the paramedics rushed in with the stretcher, Linda's breath caught in her throat. The man lying motionless, covered in blood and barely clinging to life, was Tom. For a split second, everything around her seemed to stop. The noise of the hospital faded into a dull hum as she stared at the face she had once known so well, now twisted in pain and nearly unrecognizable. Memories flooded her mind, the harsh words, the cold threats, the fear that had once consumed her daily life. But beneath the shock, Linda felt something else, the instinctive pull of duty, the need to save a life no matter whose it was. She was a nurse, and in that moment, that was all she could afford to be. "Linda, are you okay?" One of the younger nurses, Emma, noticed the shock on Linda's face and placed a hand on her arm, concern etched on her features. Linda shook herself free from the daze, nodding quickly. There was no time to explain, no time to feel anything other than the urgency to act. She joined the team surrounding Tom, her hands steady as she assessed the damage. His injuries were severe: broken ribs, internal bleeding, a collapsed lung. The likelihood of him surviving the night was slim, but Linda pushed the thought aside. She couldn't let herself think about that. Not now. The operating room was a blur of movement and sound, the surgeons working against the clock. Linda stood at the head of the table, monitoring Tom's vitals, her mind racing. Every part of her wanted to distance herself, to let someone else take over, but she knew that was impossible. She was the best at what she did, and Tom's life was in her hands. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself slipping into the familiar rhythm of the work, the past and present merging into one painful knot in her chest. Saving his life felt like a cruel twist of fate, but she couldn't deny the relief that came with each small victory, the stabilizing blood pressure, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. When the surgery finally ended and Tom was wheeled into the ICU, Linda allowed herself to breathe. She watched from the doorway as the machines kept him alive, his body battered and broken, yet still fighting. It was over for now, but the weight of what she had done lingered heavily on her shoulders. She had saved him, just as she had saved so many others before. But the question that gnawed at her was whether she had done the right thing. Tom was a man who had caused her so much pain, and now she had brought him back from the brink of death. What kind of consequences would follow? Linda stood alone in the dimly lit corridor, the sounds of the hospital distant and muted. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of anger, confusion, and a deep-seated fear she hadn't felt in years. The decision to save Tom hadn't been a choice. Not really. Her training, her dedication to her profession had taken over, leaving her personal feelings locked away, at least temporarily. But now, as she faced the reality of what she had done, those feelings rushed back with a vengeance. Tom's unconscious form was a reminder of a past she had worked so hard to escape, and now he was here, vulnerable, and she was the one who had ensured his survival. Pacing the corridor, Linda tried to push the emotions down, to regain the control she had maintained during the surgery. But it was no use. The memories came flooding back. His voice, the way he had manipulated her, the years of fear. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to stay grounded in the present. She couldn't afford to let herself be overwhelmed. Not now, when Tom's presence was about to turn her life upside down once again. The hospital, once her refuge, now felt like a trap with Tom lying just a few doors away. She couldn't bring herself to visit him, not yet. The thought of seeing him, even unconscious, was too much to bear. Instead, Linda found herself wandering through the empty corridors, trying to make sense of the storm inside her. She had done her job, that was all. But the questions wouldn't stop. What would happen when he woke up? Would he remember what she had done? Would he see it as a sign that he still had power over her? That he could manipulate her once again? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. As the hours dragged on, Linda knew she had to leave, to step away before the weight of it all crushed her completely. But the fear of what she might find tomorrow kept her rooted in place. Tom's survival had opened a door she had firmly closed years ago, and now she was left standing at the threshold, unsure whether to step through or turn back. Tom's eyes fluttered open, the sterile smell of the hospital room filling his senses as he slowly came to. The dull, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the first sound he registered, followed by the soft shuffling of nurses outside the door. As his vision cleared, Tom's gaze landed on Linda, standing at the foot of his bed, her expression unreadable. A wave of recognition and something darker passed between them. He blinked, as if surprised to see her there, but the flicker of a smirk quickly betrayed his true feelings. "Linda," he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "You saved me." Linda nodded stiffly, the air between them thick with unspoken history. She had dreaded this moment, knowing that Tom would eventually wake up, that he would be aware of what she had done. She had hoped, irrationally perhaps, that he would remain unconscious, a distant figure in a nightmare she could forget upon waking. But now he was here, very much alive, and the walls seemed to close in on her as his gaze lingered on her face, reading her in ways that made her skin crawl. "It was my job," she replied, her voice even, though the effort it took to keep it that way was immense. Tom's smirk widened into a smile, but there was nothing warm about it. "Funny, I didn't think you'd still care about me after everything." His words dripped with the same twisted charm that had once drawn her in, and Linda felt her stomach twist. She knew this game all too well, the way he could twist words and emotions to his advantage, making her question her own reality. "I didn't do it for you," she said firmly, hoping to end the conversation before it went any further. But Tom wasn't one to let go easily. "Still," he said, his voice gaining strength, "it's good to know you've got my back. I mean, who else would I trust?" His tone was light, almost playful, but there was an undercurrent of control that sent a shiver down her spine. Linda could see it in his eyes, the calculation, the testing of boundaries. He was probing, seeing how far he could push, how much he could take before she pushed back. And the worst part was, he knew exactly where her weak spots were. She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show the fear that was slowly creeping back into her heart. In the days that followed, Tom's recovery was steady, much to Linda's dismay. He began to move around the hospital with more ease, his injuries healing faster than expected. At first, he kept his distance, watching Linda from afar, a patient among many. But as the days wore on, he started to show up in places he knew she would be: the break room, the corridors, even the parking lot. Each time he would offer an innocent smile, a friendly greeting, but the undertone was always there, a reminder of the power he once held over her. "You know, Linda," he said one afternoon as he found her in the staff lounge, "I've been thinking a lot about the old days. We had some good times, didn't we? Linda bristled at the familiarity in his voice, the way he spoke as if they were old friends, reminiscing about happy memories. The truth was, those good times were few and far between, overshadowed by years of control and fear. "That was a long time ago, Tom," she replied coolly, keeping her distance. She wanted to make it clear that whatever they had shared was in the past, and that she had no intention of revisiting it. But Tom was persistent, his words weaving a web of manipulation that was all too familiar. He began dropping hints about needing help after he was discharged, casually mentioning how difficult it would be to manage on his own. At first, Linda dismissed his comments as harmless. After all, it was normal for a recovering patient to feel uncertain about their independence. But as Tom's requests became more pointed, more frequent, she realized with a sinking heart that he was laying the groundwork to reinsert himself into her life. "I just don't know how I'll manage without someone around," he said one evening, his voice laced with vulnerability. "You're the only one I can trust, Linda. Just like old times." The words hung in the air like a noose, tightening around her, and Linda felt the familiar stirrings of fear begin to take root. Linda tried to keep her distance, to maintain the boundaries that had taken her years to build, but Tom's presence was a shadow that loomed over every aspect of her life. He began showing up at the grocery store, at the coffee shop she frequented, always with a ready smile and a seemingly innocent excuse. "Just a coincidence," he would say with a laugh. But Linda knew better. This was no coincidence. This was Tom's way of reminding her that he was still there, still watching, still capable of turning her life upside down. The fear she had fought so hard to banish was creeping back, each encounter with Tom eroding the sense of safety she had rebuilt. The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice. To everyone else, Tom was just a man recovering from a terrible accident, a man who was lucky to be alive thanks to Linda's skill and dedication. But Linda saw the truth behind his charm, the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. She could see it in the way his eyes followed her, in the subtle comments he made, in the way he seemed to always know where she would be. It was as if he had taken her act of saving him as a signal that he still had a place in her life, a place she had fought so hard to take back. And now she found herself questioning just how much power Tom still held over her, and whether she had the strength to fight him off again. Linda sat in the small, warmly lit cafe, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Across from her, Sarah leaned forward, her expression a mixture of concern and anger, as Linda recounted the latest encounter with Tom. The two had been friends since childhood, their bond growing stronger through shared laughter and tears. Now, as Linda's voice trembled with frustration, Sarah's eyes narrowed, the fierce protectiveness she felt for her friend shining through. "He's doing it again, isn't he?" Sarah said quietly, though her tone was anything but calm. "Trying to worm his way back into your life." Linda nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the situation. "I thought I could handle it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he's everywhere, Sarah. Every time I turn around, he's there, pretending it's just a coincidence. I don't know how he's doing it, but I can't go through this again." The thought of Tom reestablishing his control over her life was terrifying, and the idea that he might succeed where she had fought so hard to break free filled her with a dread that was all too familiar. Sarah reached across the table, taking Linda's hand in hers, her grip firm and reassuring. "You don't have to do this alone," she said firmly. "We're going to stop him, Linda. Whatever it takes, we're going to make sure he doesn't ruin your life again." Sarah's determination was a lifeline, a stark contrast to the confusion and fear that had been gnawing at Linda for weeks. For the first time since Tom had reappeared, Linda felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could reclaim the peace she had worked so hard to build. They spent the next hour discussing a plan, their conversation growing more focused as they brainstormed ways to protect Linda from Tom's manipulations. "First thing," Sarah said, "you need to document everything. Every time he shows up, every word he says, You write it down. We need a record in case this goes to court." Linda nodded, taking notes on her phone as they spoke. The idea of a legal battle was daunting, but the thought of doing nothing was even worse. "And you need to stop engaging with him," Sarah continued. "Don't give him any openings. If he tries to talk to you, shut it down. You have to be firm." The following days were a test of Linda's resolve. Each time she saw Tom, whether at the grocery store or outside the hospital, she forced herself to remain distant, her replies curt and non-committal. She began carrying a small notebook with her, jotting down every interaction, every subtle comment he made, no matter how insignificant it seemed. It was a painstaking process, but it gave her a sense of control, a small victory in a battle that was far from over. The support from Sarah and a few other close friends buoyed her spirits, reminding her that she wasn't fighting this war alone. But the strain was evident. At night, when the world was quiet and there was no one around to distract her, Linda's mind would race with thoughts of what Tom might do next. She knew how dangerous he could be, how quickly his charm could turn into something much darker. The memories of his past threats echoed in her mind, and though she tried to push them away, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of her newfound confidence. "I can't let him win," she whispered to herself one night, staring out the window at the moonlit garden that had once brought her so much peace. Despite the fear, Linda's determination grew stronger with each passing day. She began to assert herself more firmly, refusing to let Tom's presence dictate her actions. When he showed up at the hospital, she made sure to stay surrounded by colleagues, using their presence as a buffer. When he tried to engage her in conversation, she would cut him off, turning away before he could get too close. It wasn't easy. Every interaction felt like a battle, a struggle to maintain the boundaries she had so carefully constructed. But each small victory was a reminder that she had the strength to fight back. Linda's friends rallied around her, their support unwavering. They checked in on her regularly, offering words of encouragement and practical advice. Sarah, in particular, was a constant source of strength, her no-nonsense attitude a balm to Linda's frayed nerves. "You're stronger than he thinks," Sarah would remind her, a steely glint in her eye. "He's trying to intimidate you, but you've got something he doesn't. Us. We're not going to let him get away with this." Linda clung to those words, repeating them to herself whenever doubt threatened to take over. Yet, as the days went by, the fear remained, a shadow that followed her everywhere. She knew that Tom wasn't going to give up easily. He never had. The thought of what he might do next was a constant weight on her shoulders, a reminder that her fight was far from over. But for the first time, Linda felt ready to face whatever came her way. She had her friends, her plan, and most importantly, the resolve to protect the life she had rebuilt. The news of the lawsuit hit Linda like a punch to the gut. She sat in her living room, the legal papers spread out on the coffee table in front of her, their cold, clinical language masking the venom behind Tom's accusations. He was claiming that her negligence during the surgery had left him with lasting harm, and now he was demanding compensation, both financial and personal. It was a calculated move, a way to drag her back into his web and undermine the life she had rebuilt. As she read through the allegations, Linda felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The accusations were completely unfounded, but she knew that wasn't the point. This was about control, plain and simple. The small town buzzed with the news. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by gossip and speculation. Linda could feel the weight of people's eyes on her when she walked down the street, could hear the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Some were quick to side with Tom, eager to believe the worst. Maybe she wasn't as good a nurse as everyone thought, she overheard one woman saying at the grocery store. Others, those who had known her and respected her work for years, were more skeptical, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The uncertainty gnawed at Linda, making her question whether she would ever truly escape Tom's influence. Sarah was furious when she heard the news. She stormed into Linda's house, her face flushed with anger, the usual calm in her voice replaced by a sharp edge. "This is ridiculous, Linda. He's trying to destroy you because he can't stand that you're not under his thumb anymore." Sarah paced the living room, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "We have to fight this, and we'll fight it hard. There's no way he's getting away with this." Her confidence was a balm to Linda's frayed nerves. But even as she nodded in agreement, a deep sense of dread settled in her stomach. Despite Sarah's support, Linda couldn't shake the fear that Tom's lawsuit would succeed in its true aim, to ruin her reputation and drag her back into the nightmare she had fought so hard to escape. Every time she walked into the hospital, she could feel the shift in how some of her colleagues looked at her. The easy camaraderie she had once shared with them was tainted by the uncertainty that now lingered in the air. Some offered sympathetic smiles, but others kept their distance, as if afraid that siding with her might damage their own standing. Linda did her best to push through, to focus on her work, but the tension was suffocating. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling shift, Linda found herself sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, unable to bring herself to turn the key in the ignition. The weight of everything, the lawsuit, the whispers, the fear, pressed down on her, and for a moment she wondered if she should just give in. Let Tom have his way, let him win this time, and maybe, just maybe, he would finally leave her alone. But the thought was fleeting, quickly replaced by a surge of anger. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let him destroy her now. Linda gripped the steering wheel tightly, the leather creaking under her fingers, and vowed to herself that she wouldn't back down. The lawsuit loomed over every aspect of Linda's life, its presence a constant, nagging reminder of Tom's malice. She knew she needed to prepare for the fight ahead, both legally and emotionally. With Sarah's help, she started gathering evidence, pulling together everything she could to prove that Tom's accusations were baseless. She spoke to colleagues who had been in the operating room that night, to other patients who could vouch for her competence. It was a painstaking process, but with each piece of evidence she collected, Linda felt a small measure of control return. Still, the stress took its toll. Linda's sleep was fitful, plagued by nightmares of the past, and she often woke up in a cold sweat, her heart racing. The strain showed in her face, in the shadows under her eyes, in the way her hands sometimes trembled when she thought too much about the upcoming court battle. But she pushed on, determined not to let Tom see how deeply he had shaken her. "He wants you to be scared," Sarah reminded her one evening as they sat together, sifting through documents. "But you're stronger than he is, Linda. You've proven that already." As the court date approached, the tension in the town reached a fever pitch. People talked of little else, the lawsuit becoming a focal point for everyone's attention. Linda could feel the pressure mounting, the expectation that she would either crumble or rise above it. There were days when she doubted herself, when the idea of facing Tom in court seemed like too much to bear. But each time those doubts crept in, she thought of all the battles she had already fought, of all the times she had stood her ground when it would have been easier to walk away. She reminded herself that this was no different, that she had faced Tom before and survived, and she could do it again. Linda's resolve hardened, the fear that had once threatened to consume her now fueling her determination to fight back. She knew that winning the lawsuit wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about reclaiming the power that Tom had stolen from her all those years ago. And as she stood on the brink of the legal battle that would decide her future, Linda made a silent vow. She would not let Tom define her story. Not now, not ever. Linda stood in the lawyer's office, her nerves frayed but her resolve unshaken. The walls were lined with shelves of thick legal books, their spines worn from years of use, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Across the desk, her attorney, Rebecca Stone, was reviewing the evidence Linda had painstakingly gathered over the past few weeks. Rebecca was sharp-eyed and confident, with a reputation for being relentless in the courtroom. a trait Linda desperately needed on her side. "You've done a lot of the groundwork already," Rebecca said, looking up from the file. "We have a strong case, but it's not going to be easy. Tom knows how to manipulate, and we need to be prepared for anything." Linda nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm ready," she said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the fear lurking beneath her determination. Rebecca gave her a reassuring smile, a small gesture that spoke volumes. "We'll get through this, Linda," she said firmly. "He's counting on you being too scared to fight back, but we're going to prove him wrong." The words were a balm to Linda's anxiety, giving her the strength she needed to face what lay ahead. She knew this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for her future, for the life she had worked so hard to rebuild. Meanwhile, Sarah was mobilizing the community in a way that only she could. She knew the power of numbers, how a united front could make even the most intimidating threats seem less daunting. She started small, reaching out to friends and neighbors, people who had known Linda for years and who could vouch for her character. Soon, word began to spread. Sarah organized meetings at the local community center, where she and a group of dedicated friends shared Linda's story, peeling back the layers of Tom's deception. "We need to stand by Linda," Sarah told them, her voice filled with passion. "Tom's trying to destroy everything she's worked for, and we can't let him get away with it." The response was overwhelming. People who had been on the fence, unsure of what to believe, began to see the truth behind Tom's lawsuit. They listened as Linda's friends and colleagues spoke about her dedication to her work, her kindness, and the strength she had shown in overcoming her past. They heard about the fear she had lived with, the courage it had taken to leave Tom and start over. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn in Linda's favor. The community, once divided by rumors and doubt, began to rally around her, their support becoming a powerful force that Linda could lean on in her darkest moments. Flyers started appearing around town, simple but effective, bearing messages of support for Linda. "Stand with Linda," they read, urging people to come together against Tom's malicious attempts to tear her down. Sarah and her group organized fundraisers to help cover Linda's legal fees, and the town's small businesses began to pitch in, offering their services for free or at a discount. It was a show of solidarity that Linda hadn't expected, and it moved her deeply. For so long, she had felt like she was fighting alone, but now she could see that she wasn't. She had a whole community behind her, and that made all the difference. As more people learned the truth about Tom's dark past, the whispers that had once followed Linda turned into voices of support. "I had no idea what she went through," one woman said to another in the grocery store. "It's awful what he's trying to do to her now." The community's backing didn't just bolster Linda's legal case, it gave her the emotional strength she needed to keep going. The fear that had once threatened to overwhelm her began to recede, replaced by a quiet but growing confidence. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back, and she was winning. Linda's spirits lifted as she saw the outpouring of support. Neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years reached out, offering words of encouragement and practical help. Old friends reconnected with her, sharing stories of their own struggles and reminding her that she wasn't alone. Even people who had once doubted her now stood by her side, their skepticism replaced by a determination to see justice done. It was a powerful reminder of the strength that comes from community, from knowing that others believe in you and are willing to stand with you in the face of adversity. Tom, seeing the groundswell of support for Linda, tried to push back, but his efforts only served to further isolate him. The more he lashed out, the more people saw through his facade. His charm, once so disarming, now seemed hollow and insincere. The community he had once been a part of now viewed him with suspicion and contempt. Linda, on the other hand, found herself surrounded by a stronger network than ever before. The lawsuit was still a looming threat, but it no longer felt insurmountable. She had allies, people who believed in her and were willing to fight alongside her, and that gave her the courage to keep moving forward. The sun was just beginning to set over the small town, casting long shadows across the streets as people began to gather in the town square. It was a warm evening, and the air buzzed with a mix of anticipation and unease. Linda had arrived early, her heart pounding in her chest, but her face calm, almost serene. She knew that today was going to be different. The whispers of the townspeople reached her ears, but she paid them no mind. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, on the confrontation she knew was coming. She was done running, done hiding. Today she would stand her ground. As the crowd thickened, Linda spotted Sarah making her way toward her, a determined expression on her face. Behind her, a group of friends followed, each one a pillar of support that Linda had come to rely on more than she could ever express. "You ready for this?" Sarah asked, her voice low but steady. Linda nodded, her eyes scanning the square. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied, her voice carrying a quiet strength. They didn't have to wait long. Tom arrived, his presence causing a ripple through the crowd. He walked with an air of confidence, but there was something else there too, an edge of desperation that Linda hadn't seen before. Tom's eyes locked onto Linda's, and she could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He pushed through the crowd, his gaze never leaving hers, until he stood just a few feet away. "Linda," he said, his voice low and menacing, "we need to talk. Now." The words were meant to intimidate, to unsettle her, but Linda didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall, her friends forming a protective circle around her. "There's nothing left to talk about, Tom," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "You don't control me anymore. Whatever you're trying to do, it's not going to work." Tom's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he realized that his usual tactics were failing. "You think you're so strong now, don't you?" he hissed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think these people can protect you from me? You're still the same scared little girl, Linda. You always will be." The words were meant to wound, to break down the walls she had built. But instead, they only fueled the fire inside her. Linda took a step forward, closing the gap between them, her voice steady as she spoke. "No, Tom, I'm not scared of you anymore. You don't have power over me. Not now, not ever again." The crowd around them watched in stunned silence, the tension thick in the air. Sarah stood at Linda's side, her presence a silent show of solidarity. Tom looked around, realizing for the first time that he was outnumbered, that the control he had once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers. He clenched his fists, his face flushing with frustration. "You're making a mistake, Linda," he spat, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You have no idea what you're up against." But Linda didn't waver. "The only mistake I made was letting you control me for so long," she shot back. "That's over now. It's over." Tom stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and anger. He had never seen this side of Linda before. The strength, the defiance. It unnerved him, made him realize that he had underestimated her. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, began to murmur, their support for Linda growing stronger with each passing moment. Tom's face twisted in anger as he looked around, realizing that he was losing, not just the battle, but the war. He had counted on fear to keep Linda in line, but now, faced with her courage, he had nothing left to hold on to. With a final glare, Tom turned on his heel and began to walk away, his shoulders tense with the weight of his defeat. The crowd parted for him, watching as he retreated, their silence a testament to the victory Linda had just won. As he disappeared into the gathering dusk, Linda let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her heart was still pounding, but it was a different kind of beat now, one of triumph, not fear. She turned to her friends, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and resolve. "It's not over yet," she said quietly, "but we're getting there." Sarah placed a hand on Linda's shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You did it," she said, pride evident in her voice. "You stood up to him, and you didn't back down." Linda nodded, the reality of what had just happened slowly sinking in. She had faced Tom, not as the scared woman she had once been, but as someone who had found her strength, her voice. The confrontation had been a turning point, not just in the legal battle, but in her life. She had finally taken back the power that Tom had stolen from her all those years ago. As the crowd began to disperse, people approached Linda, offering words of encouragement and support. "You were amazing," one woman said, her eyes shining with admiration. "It's about time someone put him in his place." Linda smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her that she hadn't felt in a long time. The fear that had once consumed her was slowly being replaced by something stronger: hope. She knew the fight wasn't over, that there were still battles to be fought. But for the first time, she felt truly ready. Surrounded by friends and a community that believed in her, Linda knew that she could face whatever came next. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation as people filled the wooden benches, the sound of their murmurs echoing off the high ceilings. The air was thick with tension, a palpable mix of anxiety and determination, as the townspeople gathered to witness the trial that had gripped their small community. Linda stood outside the courtroom, her heart racing as she took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she wasn't alone. Sarah was by her side, a steadying presence, along with Rebecca, her lawyer, who exuded a calm confidence that Linda desperately needed. When the bailiff called for the courtroom to rise, signaling the judge's entrance, Linda's pulse quickened. She followed Rebecca's lead, taking her seat at the plaintiff's table, her eyes briefly scanning the packed room. The support from the community was overwhelming, a sea of familiar faces that bolstered her resolve. Tom sat across the aisle, his expression carefully composed, but Linda could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He was playing his part, the wronged man seeking justice. But she knew better. Today, the truth would come out. The opening argument set the stage, with Tom's lawyer attempting to paint a picture of negligence and betrayal. He spoke with the confidence of someone used to winning, but Linda remained unfazed. When it was Rebecca's turn, she rose with a quiet authority that commanded the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady and clear, "this case is not about negligence. It's about control. It's about a man who has spent years trying to dominate and destroy the life of a woman who had the courage to break free. And now, when all else has failed, he's using the legal system as his final weapon." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Rebecca's words cut through the courtroom. He had always been able to control the narrative, to twist reality to his advantage. But today felt different. There was a strength in Linda's side that he hadn't anticipated, and it unsettled him. The first witnesses were called: medical experts, nurses who had been in the operating room, all testifying to Linda's competence and dedication. Their words built a wall around Linda's character, one that Tom's lawyer struggled to breach. When it was finally Linda's turn to take the stand, the room fell into a hushed silence. She walked slowly, deliberately, her heart pounding in her chest, but her mind clear and focused. The courtroom felt larger now, the walls towering over her, but she pushed the feeling aside. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, and now she was ready. Rebecca stood beside her, offering a reassuring nod as Linda was sworn in. The questions began simply, about the surgery, the decisions she made, and the care she provided. Linda answered with calm precision, each word chosen carefully. Then came the harder questions, the ones that delved into her past with Tom. Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself as she recounted the years of manipulation and horror that had defined her life before she finally escaped. She spoke of the fear, the isolation, the way Tom had twisted her sense of reality until she didn't know who she was anymore. As she spoke, the courtroom seemed to fade away, leaving only her voice and the truth she was finally sharing with the world. "I saved his life because it was my duty as a nurse," Linda said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "But he's trying to ruin mine out of spite because he can't stand that I'm no longer under his control." Tom's lawyer tried to rattle her, to poke holes in her story, but Linda didn't falter. She answered each question with the calm determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of her life. The jury watched her intently, their faces a mix of empathy and admiration. The strength in her testimony was undeniable, a stark contrast to the manipulative tactics Tom's side had employed. Rebecca's final questions were the most powerful, drawing out the full picture of Tom's vendetta. "Did you ever doubt your decision to save him?" Rebecca asked, her voice soft but insistent. Linda paused, thinking carefully before she answered. "No," she replied firmly. "I did my job, but I refused to let him destroy me for it." As Linda stepped down from the stand, the room seemed to exhale with her. The weight of her testimony hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the courage it took to face down someone who had once held so much power over her. The rest of the trial felt almost anticlimactic. Tom's defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence and the truth that Linda had so bravely laid bare. His lies, once so carefully constructed, were unraveling before everyone's eyes, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected. By the time closing arguments were delivered, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Rebecca's summation was concise, a final cutting blow to Tom's case. "This lawsuit is nothing more than an attempt to continue the abuse that Linda escaped years ago," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But Linda isn't alone anymore. She has the truth, she has her community, and most importantly, she has her strength. We ask you to see this for what it is, and to deliver the justice that she deserves." The courtroom was hushed as everyone waited for the judge to deliver the verdict. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside her. Rebecca was beside her, her face calm but focused, ready to respond to whatever the judge decided. Across the aisle, Tom sat rigid, his earlier confidence now replaced with a strained tension. The judge's gavel sounded, cutting through the silence like a knife, and Linda held her breath as the judge began to speak. "In the matter of Thomas Redding versus Linda Bennett, this court finds that the claims of negligence are unfounded," the judge stated, his voice firm and authoritative. Linda's heart skipped a beat, her grip on her hands tightening. The judge continued, his gaze moving deliberately from Tom to Linda. "Furthermore, the court recognizes the pattern of harassment and defamation perpetrated by Mr. Redding and orders that a permanent restraining order be issued to protect Ms. Bennett from any further contact." The words were like a lifeline, pulling Linda out of the deep water she had been drowning in for so long. The judge's final words came as a blow to Tom. "Mr. Redding is also ordered to pay damages to Ms. Bennett for defamation and harassment," the judge declared. "This lawsuit was an egregious misuse of the legal system, intended solely to harm and manipulate the plaintiff. The court will not tolerate such behavior." Linda barely registered the applause that erupted in the courtroom, her mind reeling as the realization of what had just happened began to sink in. She had won, not just the lawsuit, but her freedom from Tom's influence once and for all. Tom's face darkened with anger and disbelief. He stood, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to maintain his composure. But the carefully crafted mask he had worn for so long was crumbling, revealing the frustration and rage underneath. He looked at Linda, his eyes burning with resentment, but there was nothing left for him to do. The verdict had stripped him of his power, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in front of the entire community. With no other options, Tom turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom, the sound of his footsteps echoing ominously in the now quiet space. As soon as he was gone, Linda felt a wave of emotion wash over her, relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of closure. She exhaled a shaky breath, tears welling up in her eyes. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were the release of years of fear and anxiety, the final shedding of a burden she had carried for far too long. Sarah was the first to reach her, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's over, Linda. It's really over." Linda hugged her back, unable to find the words, but knowing that Sarah understood everything she was feeling. The crowd of supporters gathered around Linda, each offering words of congratulations and comfort. Rebecca smiled warmly, giving Linda's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You were incredible up there," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You showed everyone the truth, and they saw him for what he really is." Linda nodded, still dazed by the intensity of the moment, but grateful beyond words for the support that had carried her through the darkest times. As she looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, she realized that she wasn't just free from Tom. She was surrounded by a community that had stood by her side, unwavering and strong. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that had swirled inside. Linda stood on the steps, taking it all in, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders. The finality of the verdict was a balm to her soul, healing wounds that had festered for far too long. She could finally move forward, no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer fearing the shadow that Tom had cast over her life. The sense of peace was almost overwhelming, a quiet, steady calm that she hadn't felt in years. Tom's departure from town was swift and quiet. Disgraced and facing legal consequences, he had no choice but to leave behind the life he had tried so desperately to control. The community, once wary and divided, had come together in a powerful show of support for Linda, and Tom found himself with nowhere left to turn. His fall from grace was complete, and as he left, the town breathed a collective sigh of relief, knowing that they had taken a stand against the darkness he had tried to spread. For Linda, the end of this chapter marked the beginning of a new life, one where she was no longer defined by her past, but by the strength and resilience she had discovered within herself. As she walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by her friends and allies, she felt a sense of freedom that she had long thought impossible. The future stretched out before her, bright and full of promise, and for the first time in a long while, Linda knew she was ready to embrace it. The weeks following the trial felt like a slow, steady exhale for Linda, a release of tension that had built up over years, now finally able to dissipate. The first few days were quiet, almost surreal, as she adjusted to the reality that Tom was truly gone, no longer a looming threat in her life. Her mornings became a time of reflection, sitting in her sun-drenched kitchen with a cup of coffee, feeling the calm settle in her chest. The constant knot of anxiety that had once been her companion was unraveling, replaced by a peacefulness she had long forgotten. Returning to work at the hospital was like slipping back into a well-worn, comforting routine. But something had shifted in Linda. She carried a new sense of purpose with her, a deeper connection to the work she had always loved. She found herself drawn to patients who were going through their own struggles, particularly those who seemed to be fighting battles that weren't just physical. She recognized the signs, the hesitance, the guarded expressions, the fear that lurked behind their eyes. Linda offered them more than just medical care. She offered understanding and support, becoming a quiet source of strength for those who needed it most. One afternoon, Linda was called to the emergency room to attend to a woman who had been brought in after an altercation at home. As she examined the woman's injuries, Linda's heart tightened with empathy. The woman's eyes were filled with a familiar mix of fear and resignation, the same look Linda had seen in her own reflection years ago. Linda gently squeezed the woman's hand, offering a soft, reassuring smile. "You're safe here," she said, her voice steady and warm. "We'll take care of you." The woman looked at her, a flicker of hope breaking through the fear. It was in moments like these that Linda felt the full impact of her journey, how far she had come and how much she had to give. Outside of work, Linda began to reconnect with parts of herself she had long neglected. She dusted off the old easel that had been sitting in the attic, bringing it down to her living room where the light was best. Painting had always been a way for her to express herself, a form of therapy that words could never quite capture. As she dipped her brush into vibrant colors, the strokes on the canvas became a reflection of her healing, a dance of light and shadow, of joy and lingering pain. The act of creating something beautiful from the chaos was cathartic, a reminder that she was in control of her life's narrative. As the seasons changed, so did Linda. The fear that had once shadowed her steps was replaced by hope and a quiet confidence. She knew there would still be difficult days, moments when the memories crept back, but she also knew she had the strength to face them. Surrounded by friends who had become like family and a community that had proven its unwavering support, Linda felt a profound sense of peace. The future stretched out before her, wide and full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, she was excited to see where it would lead. Linda was finally free, not just from Tom, but from the chains of her past, and she was ready to embrace the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.